Welcome to Silent Queen's Rise. Now, let's get into the story. The real estate developer pulled his black Range Rover up to the curb outside a crumbling Victorian house on the edge of Savannah's oldest neighborhood, carrying a demolition order, a bottle of $400 champagne, and his 25-year-old girlfriend, who was already filming the peeling paint for her Instagram stories. He had come to watch his ex-wife sign away the last thing she had left. He had absolutely no idea that the woman standing barefoot in the doorway, wearing a faded linen dress and no makeup, had spent the last 4 years quietly buying up every single parcel of land he needed to build his flagship development. And he certainly didn't know that the crumbling Victorian house he'd written off as a condemned liability was sitting on the deed to a $38 million private historic preservation trust, one that his own investors had been desperately trying to acquire for 18 months. Going through a shell company they didn't realize was registered to her. Harrison Bowes was 49 years old and looked like a man who had spent a great deal of money trying to look like he hadn't aged. He was broad-shouldered, with a jaw sharpened by a $600 monthly personal trainer and salt and pepper hair that his stylist had carefully calibrated to read as distinguished rather than old. He wore dark jeans, a fitted linen blazer, and the kind of casual confidence that came from never once having been genuinely wrong about anything in his own mind. He was the founder of Bowes Development Group, a mid-Atlantic real estate firm that had spent the last decade turning neglected historic neighborhoods into luxury mixed-use corridors. He was, by his own frequent and enthusiastic declaration, a visionary. Sitting in the passenger seat of the Range Rover, touching up her lip gloss in the visor mirror, was Kendra. Kendra was 25. She had a lifestyle brand with 340,000 followers, and an absolute conviction that her presence in any room was the most interesting thing happening in it. She stepped out of the car first, her platform sandals crunching on the uneven brick sidewalk, and immediately held her phone up to capture the sagging front porch. "Oh my God, babe," Kendra said, tilting her head the way she did when she was composing a caption. "This is actually kind of aesthetic, like haunted, but make it chic." Harrison came around the front of the car, barely glancing at the house. He had seen it 1,000 times over the last 4 years. In his mind, the structure was already gone, replaced by the gleaming boutique hotel and mixed-use retail complex that was the centerpiece of his Savannah Meridian project. The project that was supposed to make him the most important developer in the Southeast. The project that had stalled for 18 months because of a land title dispute he couldn't resolve. A dispute that led directly back to this house and to the woman inside it. "She won't be difficult," Harrison said, mostly to himself. "She never had the backbone for a real fight." He reached into the back seat and pulled out a slim legal folder. Nora Wren had lived in this house for all 4 years since the divorce. The house had belonged to her grandmother, passed to her mother, passed to her. When Harrison had first seen it during their marriage, he had called it charming. When he decided he no longer wanted to be married to Nora, he had called it a money pit. In the divorce settlement, he had let her keep it, along with a minimal spousal support agreement and the quiet, barely concealed contempt of a man who believed he had made a generous gesture towards someone who would never amount to anything without him. He had been married to Nora for 11 years. For the first 6 of those years, she had been his most important business partner, a forensic land use attorney, with a mind like a surgical instrument who had navigated every zoning variance, historic preservation challenge, and community opposition hearing that stood between Harrison and his projects. She had done it quietly, methodically, without ever asking for her name on a press release or a seat at the table when the ribbon was cut. She had simply solved the problems and handed him the wins, and he had accepted them like weather, inevitable, unremarkable, something you only noticed when it stopped. When Nora stopped. The Savannah Meridian project had immediately started bleeding. Harrison knocked on the front door. The sound landed heavy in the warm Georgia afternoon. For a long moment, there was nothing but the hum of cicadas and the distant sound of Kendra narrating her Instagram story in a low voice behind him. Then, the door opened. Nora stood in the threshold, and Harrison felt something shift uncomfortably in his chest, though he would never have named it correctly. He had been expecting to see someone worn down. He had been expecting the particular exhaustion of a woman who had spent 4 years in a crumbling house on a modest budget, slowly realizing the limits of her life without him. Nora looked like she had been sleeping 8 hours a night and eating food that someone had actually thought about. She was 42, but she had the quality of stillness that some women develop when they stop performing for anyone's benefit. Her dark hair was pulled back loosely. She wore a simple linen dress in a shade of dusty rose that probably cost nothing, and somehow looked like everything. Her feet were bare on the worn oak floors. Her eyes, which were a very particular shade of gray-green, landed on Harrison with the mild, impersonal interest of someone identifying a species of bird they had already catalogued. "Harrison," she said, not surprised, not flustered, just acknowledging a fact. "Nora." He recovered his practiced ease. "You look rested." "I am," she said. "Come in." She stepped back and held the door open. Harrison moved forward, and Kendra followed, still holding her phone, gaze tracking the details of the entry hall. The wallpaper was original, an intricate Victorian botanical print in faded sage and cream, the kind of pattern that interior designers now flew to estate sales in Connecticut to find. The wide plank floors were original heart pine, burnished dark with age, the kind of wood that simply could not be replicated in any material made after 1940. The crown moldings were intact. The original brass hardware on every door gleamed softly, not from polish but from use. "Okay," Kendra said, lowering her phone a fraction, something shifting in her expression. "This is actually—" "Kendra," Harrison said quietly, a warning in his voice. Nora led them through the entry hall and into the back of the house. Harrison was composing his opening remarks in his head, organizing the reasonable, businesslike pressure points he intended to apply. He turned the corner into the main room. He stopped walking. The back of the house was something else entirely. At some point in the last 4 years, Nora had opened the rear of the structure to a private walled garden that Harrison had no memory of, as if the property line extended far beyond what he had assumed. The interior wall had been replaced with a series of original steel frame casement windows, salvaged and restored, that flooded the room with garden light and made the entire space feel like the interior of a terrarium, lush, green, softly luminous. The ceiling had been stripped back to original exposed timber beams, dark with age, running the full 30-foot depth of the room. Every piece of furniture was the kind of thing you found when you had spent years knowing exactly what you were looking for. A long refectory table in bleached walnut, a pair of curved reading chairs in deep tobacco leather, bookshelves floor to ceiling on the east wall holding actual books that had been read. On the south wall, above a restored original marble fireplace, hung a single large canvas. It was an abstract work in deep indigo and raw umber that pulled the eye immediately. The kind of painting that created the sensation of standing at the edge of something vast. Harrison had a passing familiarity with the contemporary art market, enough to recognize the quality, and enough to feel a sudden, specific unease about not recognizing the artist. "Please," Nora said, gesturing toward the refectory table. "Sit down. Can I get you anything?" "No," Harrison said, setting the legal folder on the table with deliberate purpose. He needed to reestablish the frame. He was here on business. He was doing her a favor. "I appreciate you seeing me on short notice. I know it's not ideal." Nora sat down across from him, her hands folded on the table, her posture the precise posture of a woman who had spent a decade in courtrooms and mediation rooms and knew exactly how much space to take up and how much to leave empty. Kendra sat beside Harrison, her phone face down now, her eyes still moving around the room with something she was working hard not to let show on her face. "It's about the Meridian parcel consolidation," Harrison began. "I know what it's about," Nora said. Harrison paused. He had expected her to need context, to need him to explain the situation in accessible terms. He recalibrated. "Then you know we're in final preparation for the Meridian development. We're at the stage where every remaining parcel needs to be under unified ownership before we can proceed to groundbreaking. There's a title issue that's been flagged in the survey." "The Albemarle Strip," Nora said. He paused again, a fraction longer this time. "Yes. The 340-foot corridor along the western boundary of the site," Nora continued, her voice even and explanatory, as though she were laying out the terms of someone else's problem. "Without it, the Meridian footprint doesn't meet the Savannah Historic District's minimum setback requirements, which means you can't get your certificate of appropriateness from the Preservation Board, which means you can't break ground, which means your 18-month timeline is now meaningless, and your anchor investor, Seaboard Capital Partners, is going to pull their $60 million commitment if you don't have a signed ground lease by the end of the fiscal quarter." Harrison stared at her. The practiced openness of his expression had become something much harder to maintain. "You've been following the project," he said. "I've been adjacent to the project," Nora said simply. The Albemarle Strip runs along the back boundary of this property. It's been in my family's deed since 1962. It was an easement corridor that my grandfather negotiated with the city when they realigned Hartwell Lane. It transferred to me in the estate settlement. Harrison opened the legal folder and slid a document across the table. This is a purchase agreement for the Albemarle corridor. We're offering fair market value. $1.2 million for a 3 to 40-foot right-of-way. That's a significant premium over assessed value, Nora. Enough to let you address some of the deferred maintenance on this property. He glanced, briefly and deliberately, at a water stain on the ceiling near the far window. Kendra picked up her phone again, but she wasn't filming the room anymore. She appeared to be reading something. It's generous, Harrison continued, steadying his voice with the warmth he used in investor presentations. I think you know that. I know the last few years haven't been easy financially, and I don't want to make this harder than it needs to be. Sign the agreement, take the money, and you can stop worrying about this house. Nora looked at the purchase agreement. She did not touch it. She looked back up at Harrison with the expression of someone who has already solved the equation and is simply watching the other person catch up. Who owns Seaboard Capital Partners' Savannah Designated Development Fund? Nora asked. Harrison blinked. That's not relevant to. The fund is administered through a Delaware Series LLC called Meridian Anchor Holdings, Nora said. Meridian Anchor Holdings has 3 named partners: a private equity group out of Atlanta, a family office in Charleston, and a preservation investment trust called the Hartwell Landmark Collective. She paused. Do you know who manages the Hartwell Landmark Collective, Harrison? He said nothing. I do, Nora said. I've managed it for 3 years. My grandmother endowed it in her will. The mandate of the trust is to acquire, restore, and hold historically significant properties in the Savannah Historic District in perpetuity. She tilted her head, just slightly. The trust has been one of your anchor investors' silent co-investors since the Meridian Project's initial capitalization round. The room was quiet. From the garden beyond the casement windows, there was the sound of a fountain, a low, steady pour of water that had been there all along, but was only audible now. That's not possible, Harrison said. His voice had dropped below its confident register. We did full disclosure on all investor participants. You did full disclosure on the named entities, Nora said. Hartwell Landmark Collective was disclosed as a passive preservation co-investor at the fund level, which it is. But the trust's acquisition portfolio includes, she paused, this property, the Albemarle Corridor, the Grenville Street Carriage House, the 2 parcels on Drayton that you've been trying to acquire through your broker for 8 months, and the mineral easements on the northwest corner of the Meridian footprint that your survey team flagged last fall. Harrison felt the particular physical sensation of a man realizing that the room he thought he'd walked into was not, in fact, the room he was in. You've been acquiring parcels, he said. It was not quite an accusation. It was the slow, nauseating recognition of an architecture he hadn't seen. I've been honoring my grandmother's trust mandate, Nora said. The Hartwell Landmark Collective has a fiduciary obligation to acquire and protect historically significant land in this district. These parcels all qualify, Nora. Harrison's voice shifted. The business register was cracking. Something underneath it was beginning to show through. Not rage, not yet, but the precursor to it, the white-edged panic of a man watching his footing disappear. How long have you been doing this? Since about 8 months after the divorce was finalized, Nora said. Kendra set her phone down flat on the table. Her face, which had spent the better part of the afternoon cycling through performance and posturing, had gone completely still. You cannot hold up a $200 million development because of historic easements, Harrison said. His voice had recovered some of its authority, the practiced firmness of a man who had spent 20 years talking rooms into agreement. The city will find a workaround. The Preservation Board will negotiate. I have relationships with every commissioner in this district. You do, Nora agreed. But the Hartwell Landmark Collective has standing as a preservation entity to file for a permanent historic conservation easement on every parcel in its portfolio. I filed for the easements 14 months ago. The State Historic Preservation Office granted provisional status 8 months ago. She reached into the pocket of her linen dress and set a single folded piece of paper on the table beside the purchase agreement Harrison had brought. Permanent status was granted 6 days ago. Harrison stared at the paper. He did not pick it up. Conservation easements run with the land, Nora said, in the same tone she had used years ago, explaining zoning law to his contractors, patient, precise, carrying the specific weight of someone who already knows every objection you're about to make and has already closed every door. They are not negotiable by the current property owner. They cannot be removed by municipal authority without a federal challenge. The Albemarle Corridor, the Grenville Carriage House, and the Drayton parcels are now permanently protected from development of the type the Meridian project requires. She paused. You cannot build your hotel on a federally protected historic corridor, Harrison. Not with Seaboard's money. Not with anyone's money. Harrison's jaw was tight. The champagne was still in the back of the Range Rover. What do you want? He asked finally. It came out flatter than he intended. The question of a man who has run out of other moves. I don't want anything from you, Nora said. She said it without venom, without performance. She said it the way you state a fact about the weather. I never did. You offered me nothing worth wanting, so I stopped wanting from you. The project, he said. You're going to kill the project. $200 million, 400 jobs. You're doing this because of the divorce. Nora looked at him for a long moment. The afternoon light through the casement windows moved across the table between them, slow and golden. I'm doing this because my grandmother spent 40 years protecting this neighborhood from exactly what you're trying to build, she said. She bought and restored 12 properties on a schoolteacher's salary and a deep, specific conviction that not everything of value could be converted into revenue per square foot. She left me the tools to continue that work. I used them. She looked at him steadily. That you happen to be the developer whose project they've disrupted is incidental. It is not incidental, Harrison said, his voice rising for the first time. Harrison. Nora's voice didn't rise. It went quieter. If anything, the way a teacher's voice goes quiet when a student has finally said the thing that reveals what they've missed all along. You came to my home today with a demolition permit for my neighbor's carriage house, a purchase agreement you expected me to sign without independent legal review, and... She glanced at the car through the front window. A bottle of champagne in the back of your car, which tells me everything about how you expected this afternoon to go. Kendra, for the first time since they'd arrived, looked at Harrison with an expression that was not warm. I expected you to be reasonable, Harrison said, the word carrying the particular freight it always carried when men used it to mean compliant. I am being reasonable, Nora said. I'm simply not being convenient. Harrison pushed back his chair. The movement was sharp, too sharp. The movement of a man who has lost the argument in the room and is trying to establish that he can at least win the exit. He stood up, reached for the legal folder. This isn't over, he said. I have attorneys who have cleared conservation easements before. It takes time, but it's not impossible. You're welcome to try, Nora said. She remained seated, her hands still folded on the table. My legal team at Hartwell is very good. I train most of them. Harrison turned toward the hallway. Kendra rose quickly, gathering her bag, her phone, her jacket, the carefully assembled armor of her public persona, all of it feeling suddenly like stage props. One more thing, Nora said. He stopped without turning around. Your anchor investor, Seaboard Capital Partners, is presenting their full portfolio review to their board of directors in 11 days, Nora said. The Hartwell Landmark Collective's legal team sent a letter to Seaboard's general counsel this morning outlining the permanent easement status and its impact on the Meridian project's development feasibility. Seaboard's fiduciary obligation to their investors requires them to disclose material changes to project viability. She paused. I expect they'll be in touch with you before the week is out. Harrison's shoulders had done something under his linen blazer, something that had nothing to do with posture. He walked down the hallway without another word. The front door opened and closed behind him with the particular sound of a man who wanted to slam it and stopped himself at the last possible moment. Kendra paused in the hallway, just inside the threshold, and turned back. Nora was still seated at the refectory table, the afternoon light sitting across her hands. How long did it take? Kendra asked. Her voice was different from the one she'd used all afternoon, smaller, without the performance coating. It was the voice of a 25-year-old woman who had just seen something she hadn't been expecting to see. Nora considered the question. The legal framework, about 2 years to build properly. The rest of it was just patience. Did you know when you started? Kendra asked slowly. That it would end up being his project specifically? No, Nora said. But I knew that the work mattered regardless. That turned out to be enough. Kendra looked at her for another moment, then nodded once, as if filing something away for later. She walked out. The door closed softly. From the back garden, the fountain continued its low, steady pour. Nora sat for a moment in the quiet of her house. The house that had been in her family for 3 generations. That she had spent 4 years restoring room by room, beam by beam. While everyone who knew her assumed she was simply surviving. She looked at the conservation easement confirmation on the table. She looked at the unsigned purchase agreement beside it. She stood, picked up both documents, walked into the kitchen, and set Harrison's purchase agreement in the paper recycling bin beside the back door. She set the easement confirmation on her desk, in the file where it belonged, between 2 years of correspondence, property surveys, trust board minutes, and the long, careful architecture of a plan that had never been about him. Her phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. It was a text from Renata Colwell. No, not that name. That one was already used. It was a message from her attorney, a woman she had worked with since her first year of practice, sharp and efficient, and entirely unbothered by difficult cases. Seaboard's counsel called. They want a meeting. Tuesday work? Nora typed back. Tuesday is perfect. She put the phone down and looked out the kitchen window at her garden. The late afternoon light was doing what it did in October in Savannah, going golden and then amber and then something deeper, something that made the fig tree by the south wall look like it had been painted. The koi in the small pond near the fountain moved the way they always did, unhurried and purposeful, tracing their own quiet orbits through the dark water. She had not spent 4 years planning a revenge. She wanted to be clear about that, at least with herself. Revenge was too small a frame for what she had actually done. She had spent 4 years building something, a trust, a portfolio, a legal infrastructure, a restored house, that was worth building regardless of who it eventually inconvenienced. The fact that it had inconvenienced Harrison was a consequence of his own decisions, not the cause of hers. She had learned that from her grandmother. Do the work that matters. Build the thing that lasts. The people who underestimated you will eventually try to build on your foundation, and when they do, they will find out what it was made of. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was an email notification from the Savannah Morning News. The subject line read, Meridian Development Project under scrutiny. Anchor investor review triggered by easement dispute. She hadn't even needed to wait for the week to be out. She allowed herself one small private smile, not the smile of a woman who had won a fight, but the smile of an architect watching a structure she'd designed withstand exactly the load she'd calculated. Then she turned away from the window, walked to her desk in the back room, and opened her laptop to the work she'd been doing. Before Harrison's Range Rover had pulled up to her curb, she had 3 more parcel surveys to review and a trust board presentation to finish. The fig tree bent slightly in the October breeze outside the window. The fountain ran. She got back to work.